Today we're going to look at Chapter 3, which is Exploring Global Business. Chapter 3 has 7 learning objectives. First one, we're going to learn how to explain the economic basis for international business. Secondly, explore the methods by which a firm can organize for and enter into international markets. Learning objective 3 covers discussion of the restrictions that nations place on international trade, the objectives of these restrictions, and their results. Learning objective 4 will outline the extent of international business and the world economic outlook for trade. Number 5, discuss international trade agreements and international economic organizations working to foster trade. Finally, number 6, describe the various sources of export assistance. And then in 7, identify the institutions that help firms and nations finance international business. What is international business? Again, I mentioned in Chapter 1 narrative that there's going to be definitions will be on the exams. Definitions are very well done in these chapters. They're always in the margin, either on the left side of the page or the right side. We're going to look at a few here. International business, what is it? It encompasses all business activities that involve exchanges across national boundaries. Right quick, we're dealing with trading with Mexico. If I ask you the question, is that international business? The answer is yes, even if you're only going from 5 miles this side of the border to 5 miles the other side of the Mexico border. In dealing with international business, countries usually have what's called an absolute advantage. What that is the ability to produce a specific product more efficiently than any other nation. One example of that would be there's a couple of countries that have the absolute advantage with regard to producing diamonds. They're not found everywhere. Next is what they call a comparative advantage. That's where the ability to produce a specific product more efficiently than any other product. We'll have some examples of these. A good example on comparative advantage here, you've got country A and country B. Country B's got an absolute advantage in both products, but a comparative advantage in motorcycles. Why? It's because it is relatively better at producing motorcycles than automobiles. If you look at the chart, country B is 3 times better at motorcycles, but only 1.5 times better at cars. Looking at exporting and importing, I think you'll know the definitions of those, but you have surplus of a certain product, for instance, corn in the United States. That surplus is exported to countries all over the world. Then those countries usually do not have the ability to efficiently produce that product. The definition of exporting, again, right out of the book, where you're selling and shipping raw materials or finished products to other nations. On the opposite side of that is importing the same things. Looking at the largest states of the United States with dollar value of exports, right now and for many years it's been number 1 has been Texas. At the time of this book printing, Texas was approaching $300 billion in merchandise exports. Number 2 is California, then New York, Washington, and finally in the top 10, Ohio at only $50 billion. Balance of trade is best looked at on the slide. It shows a fulcrum and say a board on it. And the ideal situation would either be that you export more than you import, or at least what they call a balance of trade. If you look at the slide here, if you're importing more than you're exporting, you've got a unfavorable or a negative balance of trade. If, on the other hand, you're able to export more value in dollars than you're importing, you have a positive or favorable balance of trade. But at least our goal should be to have a balanced trade. This shows the trade deficits, where you have exports down low and imports up too high. The question to ask yourself on this slide is, are trade deficits bad? We might talk about that answer later. An international trade in goods and services, again, when you're measuring that import and export, you're looking at the total flow of money in and the total flow of money out, and you're usually looking at a year at a time. The chart on this slide actually shows about 14 years, and if you look at the chart, the growth has continued. You had the crash of '08, which is obvious on the slide on the chart. So you had a big drop. You dropped back to the levels of about 4 or 5 years earlier, and it stayed low for a while. It started going back up about 2010, early 2010. Different ways to organize international businesses. There's about 7 ways, at least, to organize your business. You can get a license. There's exporting. You can do a joint venture, and we'll be talking about each of these methods. You've got totally owned facilities. You can set up a strategic alliance, for which I'll give you an example. Trading companies, one of the oldest things in the international market that was used in a couple of centuries ago even. Counter trade, and then finally multinational firms. The first method of getting in international business, they call licensing. Again, it's a contract. The company that's giving the license out gets back in return a royalty or other compensation money for someone using that license overseas somewhere, for instance. There's big advantages to doing licensing. If I'm the company like McDonald's chain of hamburgers, I can expand into foreign markets with little or no direct investment. Someone comes to McDonald's and they buy a franchise, a license to go over there and do that sort of thing. It's good for small companies, particularly, that want to get a domestic known product here in the United States in the international market. You do have a concern or two when you're doing licensing of other people selling your goods or producing your goods. The product image could get damaged if you have someone going overseas and selling or producing the product that you're selling here and the quality control is not maintained. You could lose your image worldwide, not just in the other country. The original producer in this case, by giving out a license, actually is not gaining any foreign marketing experience. Again, you can export. You can use a merchant to export. They assume all the risk of ownership, distribution, and sale. What this means is this merchant purchases the product from you at some point and is responsible to distribute it, get it shipped overseas, and sell it. The way you do this is either by a letter of credit, where a bank issues a letter of credit at the request of an importer, stating that the bank will pay a certain amount of money to a stated beneficiary. Another way is a bill of lading. A lot of times you use this when you put your product on a transport carrier, say a ship going overseas. You'll provide a bill of lading to the bank or whoever financed the product, and that's the way you're going to get paid. This proves the merchandise has been shipped. Different than a letter of credit, sometimes they use a draft. What this does, this orders the importer's bank to pay for the merchandise. So once the importer's bank accepts this, the money is transferred immediately. You can also sell, besides using an export-import merchant, you can export into foreign markets other ways. You can get an arrangement made where you have an intermediary that's just simply selling your product overseas for a commission or fee. This firm may also set up offices overseas or branches in foreign countries. Joint ventures, a little bit different. This is much like just a regular partnership, but there's something that two companies get involved with together. I think one of the better examples I've used for a long time has been where Russia needed certain types of major generators. Companies like GE in the United States have the ability to build those. So they made a joint venture, which is not easy, between countries to produce these generators over a 5-year period. So GE had to deliver them, install them, provide spare parts, train the people in Russia, and the joint venture was then over. So the advantage of doing something like a joint venture, you have immediate market knowledge and access. You've got a somewhat reduced risk, and you have control over the product itself. You're building the whole product here, and the other joint venture partner is either using it or distributing it. Disadvantage, again, it's very complex. You've got not only language barriers, you've got different values of dollars and what have you, depending on what country you're dealing with. You've got a lot of commitment that's required to make a joint venture work. Totally owned facilities, it talks about in the chapter, is just simply what it says. When you do open up an overseas market, if you're either manufacturing or distributing your product and need a building overseas, you have a choice of building a new one and owning it, or leasing something in the foreign country, or purchasing something already there. A big advantage of this, if you have your own investment in the buildings, you have complete control over its operation. You own the whole thing. It's totally owned. It's a little bit more risk in a joint venture, no question about that. There's two forms of these totally owned facilities. Again, either you build it or you buy it. Different than a joint venture is another way to do business overseas. Strategic alliance, it's where you take usually two large companies that have a competitive advantage on a worldwide basis and put the products together. Good example, it's called New United Motor Manufacturing Company. They take Toyota and General Motors, who make a strategic alliance. General Motors will build a vehicle. They may buy an engine from Toyota and put it in the General Motors product. Same things happened with General Motors trucks, where they took an Isuzu diesel installed in the Chevy and GMC trucks. And that was another perfect strategic alliance that worked out well. One of the oldest ways to get in international business has been around for a couple of 100 years at least, called trading companies. They're firms that just simply provide a link between buyers and sellers in different countries. One time when I was in New York City, walking around and touring around, I ran into some signs that the company had hanging out, and it said whatever name of the company, trading company. And again, these are guys that broker more or less products and services in other countries, and they simply put people together. Usually the trading company takes title to the products and do everything it takes to move from one country or another. And that means that the trading company basically buys the product. Counter trade's a little bit different. It's kind of gets back to the old bartering system, but it's an international major bartering system. Back in the 90s, there was a problem with the developing nations that had restrictions on converting their currency into foreign currency. What happens there then, counter trade avoids that. For instance, you can take a Boeing aircraft priced at X number of dollars and trade it to a company that produces oil. They can take oil based at a certain price at a certain time, and they can offer to trade X number of millions of barrels of oil for an aircraft and sign a contract. So at that point in time, you're not dealing with currency. So it's called counter trade. Speaking of international, multinational firms that operate on worldwide scales, if I ask you that question, again, the definition is in the book. And a multinational enterprise is a firm that operates worldwide, but they don't have a specific nation that they're tied to. No surprise, the number one ranked company in 2014 and continuing is Walmart stores. Also, probably no surprise, several of the top 10 are automobile and several are oil and gas companies. Okay, different steps. When you enter the international market, it's quite a different thing than the local market. But again, it gets down to planning. So here's many steps it takes to successfully enter any international market. Number one, you got to figure out what's something that will sell over there. Number two, where do I think this will sell? Who's going to buy it? Number three, you got to look at what's it going to take to sell this product in each of the markets I'm looking at. Real important, the next step, number four, you got to set up what is my export price? How am I going to get paid? Very important. Methods and techniques. You've got to figure out a way that's safe to get paid for your export. You've got to then estimate the resource requirements and returns. What am I going to make profit? What can I expect? Then you've got to get serious and establish your overseas distribution network. You got to figure out how am I going to ship it, all the things there. Am I going to use drafts, different ways to get paid? Finally, the last two things, how do I promote it and sell it? And again, be paid properly and timely. Once you get all this set up, you can't be thinking you're finished. You're in the international market. It's very dynamic and changing at all times, which means the last step is you'll be continuously analyzing current marketing conditions, economic, and yes, you better watch for political situations overseas. Think about this now. We're going to get into restricting trade. Try to come up with some ideas in your mind. What are some of the reasons why any country would want to restrict trade? Of course, countries are usually wanting to export their products and get their balance of trade at least on a level plane or on the favorable side. At times, things come up where there's things called tariff, import duty, or you can even call it a tax. But the government may put a trade restriction on, and they call it customs, on a product in order to improve the balance of trade. If it's a revenue tariff, that's strictly the federal government, whichever country, increasing their own income for the government. Different than that, you have protective tariffs. You've got, say, a local industry in Central America being coffee, and you want to keep the price of competing imports level with or higher than the price of similar domestic products. So you may put a tariff on coffee coming into the country because you've already got so many people producing it, and you don't want the market that they're working in to the price level to drop. So an import duty is just basically a tax or tariff on something being imported into a country. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it generates income for the government. Next thing is dumping, trade restriction again. What occurs at different times, nations would try to dump a large volume of any product into a country, which could kill the market there, the local market in that area. The U.S. Commerce Department has anti-dumping tariffs and anti-subsidy tariff on Chinese solar panels. The reason that occurred, not very many years back, the Chinese actually stole our technology on making solar panels. Unknowingly, a company was able to get a $50 million loan backed by the U.S. government to make solar panels in California. The government didn't know it. In fact, the president at the time was touring the factory, talking about all the success. Within weeks, China had not only stolen the technology, but improved it and were able to produce the same panels for a fraction of the cost. And they began selling them here, and it killed the market. That business went out overnight, and the government lost the $50 million in the process. There's some barriers that don't have anything to do with tax. There's some type of a measure that a government would put on an import to favor domestic over foreign suppliers. You can do things like an import quota where you just simply limit how many of a certain item can come in our country during, say, a certain time. An embargo. When you hear that word, you're probably going to think of countries like North Korea and even Iran. When we have an embargo, anyone has an embargo, you have a complete halt to trading with any country, or at least with a particular certain product. Usually that has to do where the government's trying to accomplish some foreign policy or national security goals. Foreign exchange control, where a restriction on the amount of foreign currency can be purchased or sold. Currency devaluation, that's where you reduce the value of a nation's currency relative currencies of other countries. And this does occur ever so often, and when it does, it usually affects the most popular currency in the world, which is still the U.S. dollar. Cultural barriers. We're going to talk about some trade restrictions. Question becomes, how important is it to you that your goods are made in the USA? When I asked this in a class, asked people to raise hands, nowadays not so many hands go up. That means it's all pretty much about considering just simply price and quality, not where the product is generally made. Why do you do trade restrictions? We talked about it a little bit earlier, but you want to equalize your balance of payment or make them in a positive trade level. Sometimes you may have an industry you need to protect, or it's very weak, and you want a trade restriction there. Sometimes it's protect national security, which is very important. We don't want to be shipping out products and technology that could affect our national security. For instance, at one time, we sold technology on ball bearings to Russia many years ago. This type of ball bearings used in missile systems to guide the missiles to their target is a horrific mistake. Shortly thereafter, Russia improved their missile systems to equal the quality of the United States in a matter of targeting them. Sometimes you want to have a restriction on trade, protect the health of citizens. For instance, there's different products, usually something that's agriculture that may have a question of it producing disease. And once that is seen, or there's some of it been delivered, people are ill in the United States. That's what we usually see. and they'll have a cut the trade on that particular item for a while. Sometimes you want a trade restriction simply to get back at a country. They've got trade restrictions you don't like, so you may just want to retaliate. We're going to talk about how hard is it to get a trade restriction for any reason. And again, it's not just something you go out and do. Sometimes you want one just simply to protect domestic jobs. Okay, what are some negative things about trade restrictions? Most people feel like they're going to cause higher prices for consumers. They feel like restriction of consumers' choices can occur. Even misallocation of international resources could be happening, and you could even have a loss of jobs. Even though we had worldwide recessions in 91, 2001, we had slow growth. The crash of '08 was a global one. The economic crisis caused the sharpest decline in more than 70 years. So that means at all times we're all operating in a global economy, whether we like to or not. Right now, international trade is about 1/4 of our GDP, or total value of our gross domestic product. At this point in time, trade barriers are decreasing. We've got new competitors getting in the market at all times, creating more choices and more new jobs. Okay, international business will grow with, guess what? No surprise, continued increased use of sales on the internet. What about the outlook for trade? Economic performance is not always equal among different nations, but advanced countries slowed down and then stopped in 2009. A lot of people don't realize during that same time, emerging and developing economies continued to grow rapidly. They weren't as affected by the crash. They were smaller, and they were able to be growing their businesses at a good time for them. Experts believe now that the growth will continue. At the time this book was written, they said, in despite of high oil prices, shortly after this book was printed, oil prices fell back to the range that's more favorable to all markets. What about trade with Canada and Western Europe? That is the most efficient and most dynamic trade in the whole world. $2 billion a day is what it accounted for in 2013, what they call bilateral trade. More than 96,000 companies in America export to Canada. 70% of Canada's exports come to the United States. And by the way, that includes a lot of oil coming out of Canada is imported into the United States. Our trade with the European Union is one of the largest and, yes, most complex in the world. At the time this book is written, again, estimated goods and trade flow was about 2.7 billion a day, about 30% of global trade. How about Latin America and Mexico? That trade level has been growing about 3 to 4% a year. It's about 11 what we call free trade area countries. The countries that are listed include Mexico and pretty much the countries below Mexico down into South America. What about Japan? Small as that country is, it still continues to be the third largest economy in the world and the United States' fourth largest trading partner. What a lot of people don't realize, even when America had some periods of growth and sustainability, Japan went through 20 years or 2 decades of deflation and low growth. Japan finally is in a really, really slow level, but showing some signs of recovery at this point in time. How about our trade with other Asian countries? Our trade with Asia pretty much by 2013 and 14 was continuing to grow. No big surprise that China is now the world's second largest economy. Bilateral trade with the United States is $500 billion, and it's the third largest trading relationship in the world, which is no surprise. India is a country on the move. Its emerging middle class is growing rapidly, so they're buying more and more U.S. products, which means jobs and income for the American middle class. What about trade with Africa? What they call sub-Saharan Africa has some of the fastest growing economies in the world, where our economy is considered to be growing really well, by the way, with a 2% growth. When we achieve that, the economies in sub-Saharan Africa continue to average a 5 to 6% growth. Just the last 10 years, the trade with Africa has tripled, and at this point in time, the exports to this region is about $21 billion, again, at the time this book was written. The thing about the trade with the African continent, the trade is expected to continue to be good and positive, but there's a lot of things going on in Africa that are related to government things, makes it a little bit uncertain. Okay, what about our exports? What percent of what we call, again, the gross domestic product, which that's the total value of all products and services sold in the United States, a dollar amount each year, what percent of that is of the U.S. economy? In 2013, it was 13.5%. Exports were of the U.S. economy. That percent's been growing fairly steadily, except during, of course, recession times. The past 65 years has seen an increase of 15 times, or a 15-fold increase in the trade volume. What that's done, the end effect of that has been the rise of living standards pretty much around the world. Okay, we got a panel here that shows all the exports and imports from the U.S. in 2013. Unfortunately, it shows our unbalanced trade situation. North America in total exported $433 billion, but imported $611 billion. If you look at Europe, they're about in the same condition, exports of $290 and imports of $452. The European Union moving down, $232 billion exported to $382 imported. So when you get to looking at countries that are having a balance of trade, a positive one, you would only look at a little bit at South and Central America has a somewhat positive balance of trade. Other than that, all the other countries listed are in a negative balance of trade situation. Next is the value of U.S. merchandise, exports and imports. Again, this was tracked in 2014 on this chart. Number one trading partner, again, still Canada. Going down the line there, it's Mexico, China, Japan, and then the UK, and it goes down all the way to Belgium. You look at exports from, it's 312 with Canada, 240 with Mexico, and it continues down. With the UK is about 54. Then when you get over to China, imports 466. The second one is Canada, then Mexico and Japan. You can see the same thing on these pie charts. It gives a really probably easier picture to look at. On the left chart is the goods export shares in 2013. And again, it shows Canada being the largest. It shows all other 31.71, but that's a lot of countries. But the largest partner is still Canada. And then you have Mexico, and so on exports. Imports, again, when you look at that pie chart, China is 19%, by far the largest share. Now we're going to get into a really important area. It's international trade agreements. The one we'll talk probably about the most is called GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We're going to talk about the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. At the time of this writing, that included 160 nations that worked together to reduce or eliminate tariffs and other barriers in world trade. This GATT covers more than 90% of the world's merchandise trade. Most favored nation ensures that if any tariff reductions or trade concessions will apply to all. They have what they call rounds of negotiations starting in 1947, and every so many years they have a new one when time comes and they need to edit and change these rules. At the time of this book writing, I think they said 1994 had been the last one. In the round, whichever year it was, called the Uruguay round, that's when the World Trade Organization was set into place. Until that, even though they had restrictions and tariffs, there was really never any teeth in enforcement. So the World Trade Organization, that's the main reason that was created. What do? They oversee all the GATT provisions. That includes everything. The good thing, it has judicial powers. So if there's a trade dispute between the U.S. and China, and they can't settle it between the two countries, the WTO takes over. They'll mediate. If they cannot get the countries to totally agree, they will make a decision binding both countries involved. It's a way stronger authority than GATT has. The evolving European Union, as you probably have heard, there's been talks the last few years of part of the European Union breaking up. Right at the time of this writing again, the combination of all the economic force of the European Union is larger than that of the United States or Japan. The Union began back in 1957. Since 2002, 19 nations have shared the same currency, which we call the euro. They call it as well. We're going to get into an act called NAFTA, something that's still talked about quite regularly on the news and in magazines. North American Free Trade Agreement. This was set up between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, the original makers of the NAFTA agreement. The good thing about it, by 2008, they just about had wiped out all tariffs and quotas on goods produced and traded among these three countries. Dollar value of that, something under $3 billion a day at this point in time. Again, as any agreement's going to be, there's going to be people that support the agreements. There's going to be people that criticize it. Some of the reasons for supporting NAFTA, increases in trade and investment, is contributed to. The people that support it believe that all three countries benefit because of the great increase in sales, new partnerships, jobs, and opportunities. Creates high-paying export-related jobs, gives consumers more selection. Some criticisms. A lot of people claim that NAFTA has not achieved its goals. And again, they complain that they feel like it's resulted in job losses. They feel that this could erode labor standards and lower wages, and even undermine national sovereignty and independence. A big concern of the criticism side that NAFTA does nothing to help the environment. They feel like it needs to be revamped and be sure that the environment is involved in it. And these people that criticize NAFTA feel like it hurts the agricultural sector. Now, there's several other trade agreements around the world. You got the Central American Free Trade Agreement. That's back from 2003. Covers the other Central American countries below Mexico. You got over in Asia, the Southeast Asian nations. That was put together in 1967. You have Commonwealth of Independent States, 1991. You got other things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership put together in 2011. And in 1991, Common Market of the Southern Cone. Finally, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, otherwise known as OPEC. Now that's mostly to do with, of course, oil, and that was put together in 1960, still in existence, still quite powerful, but not near the power it had 20 or 30 years ago. Some of the programs to help you get in the export business, the U.S. government's got several things. There's independent things. There's information and help available at the SBA. There's other things like U.S. Export Assistance Centers. If you look this slide over, you'll see about 5 or 6 other government and non-government assistance programs to help you get in the export business. National Export Initiative is called NEI. This was started up in 2010, announced by President Obama. What was his goal? Trying to revive U.S. exports. This, again, is right after the crash of '08. This is something that the President, Congress would hope would revitalize our economy, particularly U.S. exports. What this meant was the federal agencies in the United States need to get together and help and promote business in foreign markets that will help create jobs in the United States. The Export-Import Bank of the United States is another good place to go. In fact, it's an independent agency of the United States government. So if you're trying to get your financing for exporting and importing, this is a good place to go and see if you can qualify for help there. There's a thing called Multilateral Development Bank. It's an internationally supported bank that provides loans to developing countries. You have the World Bank, other banks called Inter-American Development, Asian Development, African Development, and European Bank for Reconstruction. The International Monetary Fund, otherwise known as the IMF, it's an international bank. That group has right now something under 200 members. And what they do is make short-term loans to developing countries that are having a balance of trade deficit, trying to get them out of that rut. That's the end of this program.